Hey, it's Dr. Kate Walker. Thank you so much for watching today. I have Dr. Aaron Robb, and he is going to talk about counselors working with high conflict families that may or do end up in the court system. And so, Dr. Robb, I'm going to let you introduce yourself because what you do, it's really not any of my specialty. It's not in my area at all. So tell us more about what you do and how you work.
Thanks, Kate. I have been in private practice for going on quarter century now, so I have a fairly varied background. I think the big thing that got me to working with court-connected families is immediately after graduate school, my clinical internship was with an advocacy center where I did therapy with sexually abused children and their families. And I ended up doing a lot of support for law enforcement, doing investigations into those kind of cases. You hear about forensic interviewing in an advocacy center, and you think of the interviewer in the room. There's also a team of people, therapists, law enforcement, social work, behind the glass, or these days behind the video camera, who are assisting with that interview and are part of that team. That led me into doing investigations into abuse and neglect for years. And whatever else happens in family court, it is much more pleasant than being in criminal court dealing with those kind of cases. So I have a great deal of respect for my colleagues who work on the criminal side of the courthouse, because those are much more cutthroat kind of hearings where the attorneys are a lot less likely to have any kind of ongoing relationship with you. Part of my background as I've gone through this in the last couple of decades, I went back to school after completing my master's to do a research PhD in social work with a focus on the intersection of mental health and the law as a public policy kind of approach. That's led me, I now sit on the editorial board for the Journal of Child Custody. I am on the editorial board of the Family Court Review as well. And I've published a dozen different articles here and there in different areas, both Family Court Review and Journal of Child Custody, as well as the American Journal of Family Law. And I've done some other publications for various newsletters. I've won a Stars of Bars award for the Texas Bar in writing about some substantive legal issues. And
you've advocated for rule change too with the LPC board.
Oh, certainly. I think one of the big things in doing all of that education is letting everybody else know, here's the expectations and here's how to put that into place. But it's also with the rules, having the expectations in place to serve as a shield to us. Mm-hmm. One of the big changes that we've had is the rule that says you cannot give an opinion about child custody issues if you haven't been the child custody evaluator. And literally 20 plus years, the American Counseling Association has said in their ethics code, do not be both a therapist for a family and a child custody evaluator. They are two different things. And it took a long, long time for us to actually get the protections for therapists in the code and then into the licensing rules. We have a very, I think, tragic case where a judge demonstrated very clearly when somebody raised that that was an ethical boundary. The judge asked, and this is quoted in the appellate record, well, is that Dr. So-and-so's problem or is that my problem? And that, I think, typifies the utilitarian nature of the courts. The courts want a simple, straightforward solution to what is often an extremely complex family systems problem. And so it's easy when you've got a therapist in there to say, oh, well, they should do X, Y, and Z. Well, how do you know that? Did you do all of the background work that allows you to have a proper basis for doing that? And some of the worst case scenarios that I see are not the ones where somebody's completely overreaching, but it's where if they'd stopped just a little bit sooner, their information would have been useful to the court. This parent has shown up intoxicated in my office, and I've had to call the police because I was afraid they were going to drive drunk as they left. I've had plenty of folks that in my days working hospitals I've had to call law enforcement and say this person is not safe and now they're out in public. That is data that in and of itself is very useful for the courts. Taking that a step further and crossing that line to say, and now I'm going to make a custody recommendation based on that, is where the error comes in for a lot of people.
Well, so let's back up a second. Help me and anybody listening here. What is a high conflict case? What is that?
Well, and the famous Potter Stewart quote is, you know it when you see it, but it tends to be the people on that plus 2 or 3 standard deviations on the bell curve where no one gets divorced because they are happy with their co-parent. Everybody is slightly upset. These are the people that stay upset, and that their upset tends to be dysfunctional. There are a lot of people in the middle who they have significant problems. If you have a co-parent with a drug or alcohol addiction who uses violence, you've got significant issues. High conflict families are the ones that fail to resolve those. And often it's failure to resolve them over and over again because they're looking to fix their interpersonal problems in a legal setting. The court can tell you to be good to each other. The court cannot give you the skills to make that happen. And a lot of times these are folks who expect a judge to solve a problem that they themselves are unwilling to put effort into. And really, I think as we all know, if you're working harder than your client, you're doing it wrong. And the courts certainly have that because they can't be in the home parenting. They can't be the one who's setting boundaries. They can't be the one who's trying to establish healthier patterns along the way for these folks. A lot of high conflict families will tell me, oh yeah, the judge knows us when we walk into the courtroom. And they don't realize that's a bad thing. Healthy parents get their divorce decree, they stick it in a drawer, and they go on with their lives. Occasionally, they have to pull it out around tax time to figure something out. But they're not constantly fighting over every little minutia piece along the way. They're figuring out, oh, we still have to be the parents for these kiddos that we created.
So a new counselor, or let's just say a counselor who's maybe switching gears in their career, what can they expect if they're working with these high conflict families in the court system?
Well, the first thing I want to tell everybody is if you are working with people, you are eventually going to be working with high conflict people. It is a matter of time, and it's just random chance, whether that's your very first client or it's your very last client. It's going to happen at some point. What they should be expecting is a lot of times you're going to see that rescue me kind of behavior from some of the clients where they are coming in and they are spending their time in session talking about not themselves, but their co-parent. And often they don't want to change themselves. They don't want to change their approach. They want you to say what a bad person the co-parent is. And there is certainly an amount of time that needs to be spent establishing rapport with a client and helping them understand that their perspective is important, but at the same time, okay, if this is really your situation, what do you do about it is often the problem that gets brought in. And that addresses some of the adult therapy stuff we run into. When you're working with children, remembering that children exist in a family system. They don't spring, oh, they're with mom or dad today, and that's who's bringing them in, and therefore that's the only person we need information from. These days, we are now required in Texas to get a copy of the court order if you're seeing a kiddo whose parents have divorced or who are never married and are subject to a court order. This is the kind of thing that was done to us because we didn't do it ourselves as a profession. No, almost 20 years ago, no, a little bit less than that. When I was doing my LPC supervision training, I was told this is the gold standard. You should be getting this decree. You should be talking with both parents. And that gold standard was not met by enough people. And typically with high conflict families, those are the ones that are going to be offering complaints to the licensing board. And you can imagine if parent A has taken a child into therapy and told this awful horror story about parent B. And then the therapist has said, without ever meeting parent B should have supervised access only to this kiddo. Well, you can understand why parent B would complain about that. And I'm going to give a nightmare scenario because I like to talk in concrete examples.
Yes, please do.
I had a case where one of my colleagues, when I was working directly for the courts, walked around with a letter from a therapist and was like, can you believe this? And it was a letter that said, they're seeing this 8-year-old kiddo. Kiddo is completely traumatized by their mother and shouldn't see their mother until they're at least 16 or 17 years old. And the problem was this child had literally been snatched off the street in front of mom's house by dad. Dad had kidnapped this child, taken the child out of state, and was sitting in the therapy room for every single therapy session that child had. And of course, the child then gave the dad story because they were terrified of dad. They had been kidnapped. They were if anybody's not done their human trafficking training, this is one of the reasons we talk to people individually. We get everybody alone and say, what's going on, and see if their story changes. Because this kid was telling the dad's story. Well, that bigger picture, that thing that the therapist wasn't getting because they weren't contacting the other side, they weren't trying to see what was going on systemically, it led to some real negative outcomes, not just for the therapist, but for that kid. And that's why I spend my time doing training, doing outreach, that kind of stuff, because these kids who are having these disputing parents, these ongoing feuds, they suffer terribly as a result. And I think there's a lot that we as therapists can do to mitigate some of that by teaching healthier approaches.
So let me back up a second, because this is, I'm writing down these mistakes. These are things that I hear too, right? So you're a new counselor, you get a phone call. Hey, I need a counselor for my 12-year-old. Sounds innocuous. Okay, well, oh, by the way, we're divorced. Okay, so counselor first thing needs to what?
I would say it starts before that phone call. It starts with what's in your intake paperwork, because I see so many folks who still have parent, singular, no S on their intake forms, as if a child has but one adult in their lives. Now, some kids, that's what they've got. They literally have only one parent due to death, termination of parental rights, those kind of things. But the vast majority of kids have parents, plural. And so if you've got on your webpage, your intake forms, your basic data stuff is asking about, who's the parent filling out this form? Who's the other parent? Who are the other adults involved in this kid's life? You are setting an expectation for those folks that you're going to have a systemic approach with kiddos. When you've got a parent on the phone, you're directing them to those kind of forms, and you're saying, do you have the legal right to seek treatment for this kiddo? And does your co-parent know that you're seeking treatment? And the parents who say, no, I don't have to tell him or her, that may be the case. They may not have to, but it is certainly better for that child that those parents are sharing information in most cases. There are going to be some odd outliers where you've got to shield information at times, and those get super complex. And I am always available to folks for consultation.
And yes, I'm going to be posting your information for that specialized training. So this is where the disclaimer is. This is not training. This is plain and simple, is not training. I'm asking questions. This is not training. So yes.
And as I say that, there is a lot of information out there available to therapists who run into these areas where they can go, what should I be doing? And some more of the stuff that you'll be posting, the links to, for instance, North Texas Families in Transition. It's a professional work group I'm involved with, because you can't do this work in isolation. You don't know what you don't know, and you need client consultation with your colleagues to say, what am I missing here? We've put together a lot of handouts for therapists. We've put together some handouts for parents that talk about these various issues, the things that come up over and over again. And if you go to my webpage, which will also be on that set of links, I've got a bunch of white papers. I've got some of my publications. These are things that we want people to be aware of, because it's when you hear the click under your foot of the landmine, you realize you're too committed. You need to
You're
know
in.
there is a landmine.
Yeah.
You need to know you're in a minefield, and how do you avoid getting your foot on something that it's going to blow up on you one way or the other? How do you avoid the blowups in the first place? And again, very case specific sometimes with how you handle that.
So the first phone call, you're a counselor and you're hearing that there's some control that's trying to be had here. Yes, you can contact the other parent. No, you don't have to. So let's get to this rule that people come to me about. This is where people consult with me and they've messed up. Well, we didn't get the divorce decree until a month in, or they've never been married. So, there's no, and I'm like, there has to be something, right? I mean.
Well, and let me start with, no, you can make a baby without the court being involved. And I say that somewhat facetiously, but that's the really rare outlier, is somebody's bringing a kiddo to you that they don't have something in terms of, if they are a litigating family, they've got a temporary order within 45 days of going to court in almost all cases. That is a big sign for you if they say, oh yeah, we've been in court for a year, and you ask, can you send me your orders? And they say, well, we don't have those yet. That should be a blinding red flare going up for you that says this is a problem. But if they've touched the court at all, they have at least the minimum standing orders in place in any county in Texas. It may just be something very simple that says, don't pull the kid out of school, don't cash out your bank accounts, don't leave the state. That's still the order that's in place. It may not say very clearly what's supposed to happen. It is that initial stage of, I am separating and looking at filing. We're still married and I want to get kiddo into therapy. Those tend to be the problematic ones where there isn't an order in place. And then when there is an order issued, the therapist doesn't get it. If you don't have, and this goes back again to that intake process, you don't have on your forms that the client has committed to sending you any changed orders, then it's your fault for not asking versus their fault for not giving it to you. Mm-hmm. Clients lie to us. I've had clients who have gone into therapists and said, yeah, dad is MIA and we don't know how to get a hold of him and we don't have a court order yet. We're trying to get him served, where none of that has been true. Dad lived literally around the block from the therapist. Everybody knew where he was, but because the mom was bringing the kiddo in for nefarious reasons, the therapist got misused. We're helper people. We want to help people. The forensic mindset is something that says, wait, what's really going on here? And that's not where most therapists start. And that's good. We shouldn't look upon all of our clients with the kind of suspicion that a forensic investigator uses. That's probably not helpful.
Well, so, okay, this brings up the conflict of interest, because you and I talked a little bit before we started. Mm-hmm. This is a big issue and grounds for a lot of complaints with therapists, because they're trying to do two roles. Because yes, we're helpers, and maybe we haven't been system trained, and we have this bias toward one parent, and then we go to court and we say, yeah, you don't need to see your dad for 10 years. I mean, talk about that conflict of interest.
There is a fundamental role difference in working in a forensic capacity and working in a clinical capacity. It was 1996 when Professor Dan Schumann out of SMU co-authored an article about this. So locally here in the DFW area where I am based, since 1996, we have had clear, explicit delineation on this stuff. I still get folks who don't understand that there is a difference between the child's therapist, the family therapist, and the adult individual therapist. Those three hats are things that people don't understand. So I get that this more complex role is difficult. It is something, again, I've written about that. Lots of other folks have written about that over the years. But fundamentally, you are serving different masters in different roles. And we can only serve one master along the way in any given role and do it well, because they're inherently in conflict. This is one of the big problems transitioning, and it's common. You're doing marital therapy, folks decide they're going to get divorced. You continue with one of those clients because you've got a relationship with them. This has just changed your obligation to the marital unit to an individual obligation. For my research geek colleagues out there, that is a unit of analysis error, if you remember that from your Stats 101 class. It is common, and it is often okay. It is something that often works. If okay is damning with faint praise, if I'm not sitting here going, woohoo, keep doing it, is because the cases that I see are always the ones where that has gone awry. Where mom has said, well, my marital therapist continued with dad, proving that they were always on his side anyway. And it completely recontextualizes that relationship. It changes the data point that I have as an evaluator reaching out to that person, because somebody who might have told me, oh yeah, mom had these issues, dad had those issues. They're well-meaning people who were trying, but the human condition is one of irrational shoulds and failed cognition and all of that kind of stuff. It changes it from that kind of balance to, oh, and here's everything dad has done since then. And we can't go back in our memory and retain that original impression. We're constantly reaccessing those memories. I'm probably not telling anybody things that they don't know in this, but they don't think about it when they're making the decision to change their role.
Right.
And if that role, that simple common issue, is something that comes up over and over again, the uncommon crossing over into the legal realm, well, it is night and day. It is oil and water in a lot of ways. And I did a training for a local university every few years back when they had a professional development program on this. And I would routinely get 30 people in a class who had no idea. And we'd spend 8 hours and they were like, wow, I need to go learn a lot more about this. And I'm like, yeah, this is why, graduate programs are now required to do 60 hours, including a class on the law. This is why I'm about to go repeat my jurisprudence exam for, the 5th or 6th time in my career, because over and over again, something as simple as turn over your records when they're properly requested ends up in failure. For those who used to go down to the LPC board when they had open the flogging sessions at the disciplinary hearings, I can recall 4 or 5 times where people would ask, what part of 15 days to respond was unclear? And they would say it over and over again, recognizing that all the other excuses don't matter. 15 days to respond to a records request. Now, there's a whole hour-long spiel I do on how do you respond? How do you manage those responses? But I've seen people who have shredded requests for records and then had to admit to it in deposition. And if you hear deposition and think, how much money were they spending on lawyers and what did their insurance company do to them afterwards? Those are the risks to be assessing on this kind of stuff. It is one of the reasons that I mentioned North Texas Families in Transition. We do training all the time. There are other groups up here in the DFW area. There are groups down in Houston, all over, that do these trainings. There's a statewide AFCC chapter that does online trainings because we want people to avoid these pitfalls.
And we want them to do this work, though, right? I mean, because one of the things that's near and dear to my heart is trying to get providers into rural areas and, making sure that providers don't leave the field because they're doing it wrong and they've just stepped on that landmine, right? So I really want to emphasize, we're not trying to scare you out of this. We just want you to be informed as you think about going into this. This isn't just one of those things where you wake up one day and say, I hear the money's pretty good in family conflict. I think I'm going to try that.
Yeah, that is something. I think the vast majority of people who run into problems are the well-meaning typical therapist, the helper person who gets sucked into one of these cases and isn't even having it on their radar that these kind of things are going on. There are those folks out there who say, oh, this looks like easy money, when they get an attorney reaching out to them and saying, can you do fill in the blank? And they say, why, sure, without knowing what they're getting into. I think those are two different categories of folks. And there are plenty. I have a colleague out in the Tyler area who does a lot of the same kind of stuff that I do, because we need good people doing this. And I say we, the family court system needs good people doing this work, but these families need good people doing this work. The ones that are able to say, okay, you're right. Your ex-husband, your ex-wife, your co-parent is tragically flawed. And you're the person who chose to have 3 children with them. How do we deal with that in a way that's going to be as good as possible for those kids? And that, for those of y'all who do acceptance and commitment work, that has become one of my go-to points, is being mindful that no, we're not going to always have stellar outcomes, but let's focus on doing what we can. I frequently have to give the analogy to people, if you lost your leg in a car accident, we are not going to do therapy on how do you regrow that leg, because it's not happening. We're going to do therapy to talk about how do you live with your condition and get the most out of things, and how do you learn those new coping skills. And so again, for these families, and particularly these children who they never asked for their parents to be dysfunctional. And nobody gets married at the altar saying, oh yes, I want to be a high conflict disputing family and spend my retirement account on attorneys. They mean well when they go into this. They just don't have the skills to do well.
So what advice would you give? I know I only have you for a couple of more minutes. Tell me what advice, like just takeaways that you would want a therapist thinking about going into this. What are some, just 2 or 3 takeaways?
The first one is, you don't know what you don't know. And so having a good network to reach out to and to start sensitizing yourself to all sorts of different subspecialty areas about what's going on. The second is that differences in values are not the same as bad parenting. If I like chocolate and you like vanilla, we are never going to pick out the best flavor of ice cream. If our job is to buy a pint of ice cream, that is a functional way to approach things. And a lot of times I get perfectly good co-parents who are chocolate and vanilla problems. Differences in religion, differences in political background. Different doesn't mean bad. Different may just be a coping issue that you've got to figure out how do you deal with those things. And I think the last one is, if you're dealing with somebody who is telling you something that you can't verify, verification is kind of the go-to point of court-involved folks. Everything that you're going to be able to testify back to, everything that you're going to be dealing with that family, is either verifiable or it's people looking through their lens on stuff. XYZ thing happened and I feel this way about it is very different than XYZ thing happened and they're doing it wrong because XYZ is bad. It is the great, Shakespearean, there is nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so, that every cognitive behavioral therapist should have in their hearts. And so those are the things that I think I would leave with. As everybody can probably tell, I can go on and on for hours about this kind of stuff because
it's important. It's important. And it's not just important to the families. And I hear that in everything that you say. You have a heart for this and you have a heart for these kids. I come from the place of, I train supervisors and I train new supervisors and supervisors who are wanting to build a business. And should I take this person on or that person on? And no, not if you're not trained in that, right? So it's different. We have these new self-employed, I don't know when this will air, but we'll have these new self-employed LPC associates who may just want to jump off and do this. And what I hear you saying is training, 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 and more training.
Chasing the money will never be the right way to set up a business. If you do good work, the money follows. And that is one of those critical things. And exercising your no muscle to say, no, this isn't the right case for me right now. I do reunification therapy. which if anybody is
Wow.
unfamiliar with that term, look it up. It's hellish. I'm just going to be real frank. It is the hardest thing I have ever done in my entire career. And I used to help prosecute sex offenders and treat those kids. So I can only do one, maybe two of those cases at a time. And my practice is 100% court connected. If you have a clinical practice, adding one court connected case to it will overshadow so much that it will be hard to manage. Jumping in on a reunification case, it's like taking on 20 court connected cases all at once. And so you've got to be able to say, do I have space for this, both in my clinical hours and practice and also in my own head? These are hard. These are things that sometimes still keep me up at night, because every time I make a mistake, kids suffer. And I am going to make mistakes because that's the human condition. It is just a lot more likely to be pointed out on cross-examination when I'm doing these kind of cases than somebody who has a slip up in a therapy office. And, it's not going to ever be a big point of contention.
This is huge. And so again, I'm going to post contact information for you because you're willing to answer questions. I mean, I know you don't have all the time in the world, but you're willing to answer questions. And I'm going to post the links for the training and the publications, the organizations. Thank you again, just so much for your time and your expertise. And I hope counselors and supervisors who are listening to this pay attention. Also, I just want to brief commercial. You are speaking to the Texas Supervisor Training Monthly Consultation Group in November, I believe, which is for supervisors only. And so I'll be promoting that as we get closer to that. But that is going to be so valuable for us as supervisors. So thank you. Hang on a second. I'm going to hit pause, but you hang out. Thanks again for watching. And pause.